That Christmas, the gift I gave my son was a house worth almost $500,000. And the gift they gave me this year was kicking me out of that very same home. Sarah stood in the doorway blocking me. Lucas wouldn't even look at me like I was some stranger off the street. What they forgot was the last key to that house was still in my hands. Before we go on, I truly appreciate you spending your time here. Remember to subscribe and share wherever you're listening. And now, let me take you back to that moment. I stood on the front porch, my breath still holding on to the late December chill. Christmas was only a few days away, and the lights along the roof kept blinking, steady, calm, as if they didn't care that I'd just been kicked out of the house I'd nearly finished paying for. I heard the door close behind Sarah, just a soft click, but sharp enough to cut straight through me. Lucas didn't say a word. He dodged my eyes like some kid scared of getting caught. But I knew better. He wasn't a kid anymore. On paper, he was the head of the household. But in reality, I was the one who kept that roof standing. I stood there for a few seconds trying to keep my hands from shaking. Not because of the cold. Because I didn't trust myself not to say something I'd regret for the rest of my life. When you're past 70, you don't have a lot of time left to fix mistakes. But you're still sharp enough to know when someone is making a fool out of you. I stepped off the porch, each step heavy like I was carrying stones. No one called after me, not a single dad wait. Just that thick, uncomfortable silence, the kind that treats you like an uninvited guest ruining their family dinner. I opened my car door, sat in the driver's seat, and took a deep breath before shutting it. Everything that had just happened replayed in my head like a fast-forwarded film. Sarah's cold stare, Lucas's hunched, spineless posture, and my daughter-in-law's sweet, sugary voice when she said they needed boundaries, even though every syllable dripped with calculation. Boundaries. I'd paid 85% of that mortgage. I'd used my own credit to guarantee their loan. I'd been the only boundary keeping that house from the bank's hands. Yet somehow, I was the one told to stay outside. When the engine hummed to life, I didn't pull out right away. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my recent calls. The line mark, attorney, sat right at the top, glowing like it was daring me to tap it. I paused, glanced into the rearview mirror. The house stood there pretty bright and completely foreign. I remembered the day Lucas called me 5 years ago. Dad, I can't have Sarah living in a temporary rental anymore. I want to start our family somewhere decent. I saw the urgency in his eyes back then, and I opened my wallet before my brain had time to do the math. Maybe that was the moment everything went wrong. I backed out of the curb and started driving. The whole neighborhood was wrapped in Christmas lights, every house glowing warm and golden. I used to think that warmth was something I was building for my son, a home, a foundation, a chance for him to be a real man. But the farther I drove, the more hollow I felt. Being betrayed at this age. It doesn't explode like it does when you're young. It settles in your chest like a thin sheet of ice, cold enough to make breathing hard. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a coffee shop that had closed hours ago. No one around. Just a dim street light shining straight through my windshield. I leaned forward and opened the glove compartment. Inside were copies of the mortgage, the guarantees, the payments, and the transfer receipts from the past 5 years. Every line on those papers stared back at me like a cruel reminder I'd turned myself into a walking wallet, and they'd gotten used to it. I let out a dry laugh, barely even a sound. Enough was enough. It was time to do what I should have done years ago. I hit Mark's number, David. "What's going on?" he asked, clearly surprised I was calling at this hour. "Mark," I said slowly, each word scraped raw. "Get the paperwork ready. I'm pulling my mortgage support from Lucas and Sarah's house." He went silent for a few seconds. "David, are you sure this is going to hit them hard?" "I'm sure," I said. "They've got 90 days to pay what's left. No negotiation." Mark sighed, but he didn't argue. "All right, I'll take care of it. You're fully within your rights. And with everything you've already paid, you've got the upper hand." I looked out the window. The streetlight made my wrinkled hands look even older. "Mark," I said quietly, "it's time those kids learned to stand on their own 2 feet." When I hung up, silence filled the car again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like the calm after a storm, a peace I hadn't let myself have in years. And that was only the beginning. I drove home in silence, but not the heavy, suffocating silence I'd felt walking out of Lucas's doorway. This was a different kind of quiet one that let my mind sort things out. I'd finally made the call I should have made years ago. For so long, I kept telling myself they're still young. I can handle it. Let me just keep helping. But tonight, when that door slammed shut in my face, something inside me cracked. When I got home, I hung my coat over the chair by the door. The house was still no laughter, no footsteps. I used to hate that silence. It reminded me I lived alone. But tonight, for the first time in years, the quiet felt comforting. At least this silence didn't judge me, didn't treat me like a walking wallet. It was simply mine. I made a cup of hot tea, laid the paperwork in front of me, and turned on my old desk lamp. The warm yellow light fell across the numbers I'd stared at for 5 years, yet never really looked at. I remembered every transfer slip, every monthly payment I made so Lucas wouldn't have to worry about the bank calling. I thought I was helping him learn to be the man of his house. But looking at it now, maybe I shielded him so much that he never learned what responsibility even meant. I opened each folder. Every page told a story. I'd been pretending not to read the payments, the repairs, the insurance, and all the times Lucas called saying, "Dad, I didn't get that raise. Things are tight this month." And every time I agreed, every time I stepped in, I thought I was doing the right thing. But if the right thing ends up making someone worse, is it still right I stopped at one document I'd practically forgotten about the loan guarantor file? My name was printed in bold at the top. If Lucas couldn't pay, the bank would come after me first, and Sarah knew that she was the one who pushed Lucas to talk to Dad. I remembered that dinner clearly, her sweet smile, her soft voice telling me that having a guarantor would lower the interest rate. I believed her. I thought she wanted to build a solid home. But the more I looked at these numbers, the more I realized I'd walked into a game without knowing the rules. I leaned back and took a sip of tea. It had already cooled. My throat burned, not from the drink, but from the truth rising up inside me. Getting kicked out of the house was just the final drop in a cup they'd been filling for years with. Every moment they treated me like an obligation, like a secondary bank account they didn't even have to say thank you to. I opened my laptop and scrolled through old emails. There they were, scattered through hundreds of lines, the bills Sarah sent me every holiday, every birthday of Lucas's, even random weekends. The messages always had that tone, asking but sounding like demanding. Never a please, never a thank you, Dad. Just, "Dad, send this for us. Dad, handle this." I flipped to the page that totaled everything I'd spent, over $400,000. I stared at that number for a long time. It felt like staring at my own life, heavy, endless, and unappreciated. Then I logged into my bank, not to check the balance, but to compare the last 5 years of transactions. I wanted to see the real shape of the sacrifices I'd made. And there it was, plain as day. The steady transfers, the payments I covered, the automatic mortgage drafts I'd set up from my retirement account. I sank into my chair, rubbing my temples. I wasn't angry in the way young people get angry, loud, explosive, destructive. My anger was the cold kind, cold enough to make anyone who touched it feel numb. But emotions weren't what I needed now. What I needed was clarity. I gathered every document, stacked them into one neat pile, and set it on the right side of the desk, the side I always reserved for big decisions. Then I wrote a short note. "Tomorrow send everything to Mark." When I turned off the lamp and stood up, I looked around the room. It wasn't as nice as Lucas's house. Not as big, not new, not bright. But it was mine. I didn't need anyone's permission to walk inside. No one could kick me out. And most importantly, no one here saw me as a burden. That night before I went to bed, I looked out the window. Snow had started to fall. A new Christmas was coming, but for me this was the first Christmas in years where I finally knew what I had to do. And tomorrow, everything would start to change. Not for them, but for me. I woke up earlier than usual. No alarm needed. At my age, sleep comes light, especially when there's something in your head that hasn't settled yet. Outside the window, the sky was still dark. A street lamp glowed through a thin layer of snow. I pulled on a wool sweater, felt the cold seep through the fabric. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to do what needed to be done. I sat at the kitchen table and switched on the small lamp. Its amber light washed over the old wooden surface. The stack of documents I'd prepared last night was still there, quiet, steady, unblinking. I picked it up, slid everything into my worn leather briefcase. Then I poured myself a cup of black coffee. The smell rose strong, bold, warming my chest just enough. Today my hands wouldn't shake. Today there would be no hesitation. When I lifted my phone to call Mark, my heartbeat slowed the second my finger touched his name. Not from doubt. Just the calm that comes when you finally see things clearly. I dialed. David Mark answered right away, his voice still rough with sleep. I'm guessing last night wasn't just an emotional reaction. No, I said, steady and cold as the morning air. I want to start the process today. If you need more signatures, I'll come to your office. Good, he said. I'll prepare everything. Once I submit the withdrawal, the bank has 48 hours to respond. After that, they'll send Lucas and Sarah a notice to pay off the remaining balance. Are you ready for how they might react? I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness slide down my throat. Mark, I've been ready since the moment they shut that door in my face. The call ended. I set the phone down, drew in a long breath. There was nothing left to think about. I grabbed the briefcase and left the house. The streets were quiet. Only a few cars passed by. I reached the law office just as the sun rose over the old building, scattering little shards of gold across the glass door. A new day. A new life. I walked in, met with Mark, and signed everything he handed me. It was clean, fast, professional, no room for emotion. And I liked that. When you're doing the right thing, there's no need to tremble. Stepping out of the building, I paused on the top step, hands tucked into my coat pockets. The wind was cold, but not cruel. It felt like a weight that had been sitting on my chest for years had finally slid off. My phone buzzed. An email. From the bank. They confirmed they'd received the request to withdraw my mortgage support and would proceed according to regulations. I stared at the message for a while. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was release. Slow, steady release. Like a rope that had been tied around me for 5 years was finally being loosened, knot by knot. I drove to a small diner I used to visit before I retired. It always smelled like fresh coffee and warm pastries, and the quiet chatter of a few old folks like me. I took a seat by the window and ordered my usual fried eggs toast and another cup of black coffee. Sitting there, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through social media. I don't check it often, but something nudged me to look this morning. And then I saw it, Sarah's post. A long one. Written last night, right after I left. She talked about setting boundaries with a toxic relative, about the older generation being overbearing, about the invisible pressure that keeps young couples from living their own lives. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. I read the whole thing. No anger, no shock. Just a tired kind of sadness, the kind that makes you too weary to revisit old explanations. A woman who could kick her father-in-law out at Christmas time and then post publicly to blame the victim I'd been blind for far too long, thinking she was just impulsive. No, she knew exactly what she was doing. I set the phone down, wiped my hands with a napkin, and got up to pay the bill. I didn't need to respond to Sarah. I didn't need to argue. I knew what would happen in 48 hours. And once the bank notice landed in their inbox, her entire story would fall apart. No one would buy it anymore. I stepped outside and pulled my coat tight as the cold hit my face. Snowflakes drifted down, landing softly on my shoulders. But I felt strangely light. I knew I was walking into a battle I should have begun years ago. A battle not to punish them, but to take myself back. 2 days passed in an unusual silence. I returned to my old rhythm-cooking dinner for myself, wiping down the wooden table long faded with time, watering the plants out on the porch. But no matter how much I tried to keep my mind at ease, Lucas's silence felt like a cold needle poking at every thought. I knew the email from the bank had been sent. The system was always accurate, never delayed. Which meant they had read it. Which meant they understood what was happening. And yet for 48 hours, not a single call, not a message, not a word of explanation. I guessed Lucas was scrambling trying to figure out how to face the situation without actually talking. He had always been like that since he was a child, avoiding problems when he was wrong, going quiet when he was stuck. The only difference was that in the past, I would be the one to step forward, reach out and pull him out of whatever mess he had gotten himself into. But now, I chose to stay still, to let him decide the kind of man he wanted to be. That night, while I was cleaning the kitchen, the phone finally rang. Lucas's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds before picking up. Dad? His voice was hoarse, as if he'd just come through a storm inside himself. I got the notice. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to hear what he would say next. Dad, you really did this? Lucas asked, his voice trembling slightly, withdrawing the guarantee. It means our house. I know what it means. I cut him off calm, to the point of coldness. I read it carefully before signing. There was silence on the other end. I could hear his breath ragged, held back like he was trying not to break. You couldn't call me first, Lucas finally said quietly, like a child looking for an escape. You couldn't have talked, like father and son. I put the dish towel down and leaned on the table. You want to talk? On Christmas, I stood outside your door for nearly 5 minutes. You didn't open it. And now you ask why I didn't talk first. I heard Lucas swallow hard. Then a small, bare truth came out so soft I had to hold my breath to catch it. Sarah didn't want you to come in. Just one sentence. But it cut like a blade straight through the space I'd been trying not to touch. I shut my eyes. Not because it hurt, but because the clarity made everything feel strangely lighter. At least I knew I hadn't imagined it. All right, I said slowly. So, are you calling to explain? Or because you're afraid of losing the house? The question made the other end fall completely silent. Almost half a minute later, Lucas finally murmured, both. I looked outside the window. The snow was falling thicker now. The streetlights reflected on its surface, turning everything a cold, yellowish white, like a thin frost coating the truth. You know, Lucas, I said, my voice steady and tired. I didn't withdraw the guarantee to punish you. I did it to remind you that responsibility can't sit on someone else's shoulders forever. But we can't afford the payments on our own. I'm trying to get an extension. What you ask for is your business, I replied. My business is to stop letting others define my place in the family. Lucas sucked in a sharp breath, struggling to hold himself together. I didn't blame him. Change is always painful. Dad, I was wrong, he said softly. I didn't know what Sarah wrote. If I'd known I cut him off, I read it. And I don't need an explanation for that post. What I need is to see that you can stand on your own 2 feet. There was the sound of a door closing on his end. He was probably moving somewhere Sarah couldn't hear. I'll figure it out, he said, this time with more resolve. I don't want to lose the house, and I don't want to lose you. I exhaled, not out of softness, but because finally I heard something I had waited years to hear, a man's voice in his words. Then prove it, I said, with actions. I heard Lucas whisper, okay. The call ended. I set the phone down and looked into the darkness ahead. It wasn't victory nor defeat. It was simply the first time in a very long time that I felt I had laid the right first brick in rebuilding the boundary between a father and a man who had lived far too long in a shadow he was never meant to live under. Duoi jai laban dich tieng anchi dich nguyen von hong them bin luan. After the call with Lucas that night, I didn't feel the relief people often describe in books or movies. No sudden release, no sense of victory. What I had was a long stretch of silence, enough for me to sit down in the old armchair and stare at the wall for several minutes. Maybe that's what aging is. People stop reacting intensely. What remains is a stillness that can sometimes be even more unsettling. But I knew the story wasn't over. It was only the beginning of the chain reaction I had intentionally triggered. And the next morning, that reaction began. Around 10, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I knew who it was before I even picked up. "Mr. David," a woman's voice rang out sharp, high and full of possession. "This is Sarah." I straightened my back, though no one had asked me to. "I know. I just learned what you did," she said immediately, wasting no time. "Do you understand that your actions will ruin everything?" I answered with a tone so steady even I found it cold. I simply withdrew the guarantee. I voluntarily added, "Nothing more, nothing less." "Nothing more, nothing less." Sarah gave a cold, cutting laugh. "You withdrawing the guarantee means the bank will reevaluate the loan. It means we'll have to pay an amount we can never possibly manage." "I know." She choked for a second. "If you know, why would you do it?" I placed my hand on the table, tracing the small crack I had grown familiar with over the years, because I no longer want to be treated like someone standing outside the family. Sarah fell silent. I heard her breathing hard on the other end, as if she were trying to restrain her real emotions. "You're turning this into a personal issue," she finally said, lowering her voice but without softening it. "And we're about to lose our home. Where do you expect us to go? What is Lucas supposed to do?" Then she added, like a final blow, "Have you even thought about your grandchild?" That sentence stabbed straight into my chest, but instead of weakening me, it made me stand firmer. "Don't drag a child into this," I said, slow and steady. "My son is that child's father, not me. He needs to learn how to shoulder responsibility." Sarah shot back immediately. "What about your responsibility? You promised to help." "No," I cut in. "I never promised unconditional support, no matter how the two of you behaved. And the post you wrote was the last line." The line on the other end went dead quiet. I guess she hadn't expected me to know about the post. "I don't want to argue," Sarah said, her voice finally lowering. Not out of respect, but because she'd realized she couldn't sway me by raising it. "I just want to know, will you reconsider this decision? If we apologize?" I lifted my head and looked toward the window. The snow had stopped leaving behind a clean white layer like a blank page. A fitting image, since this conversation marked the end of something that had been written too long. "No," I replied, concise. "Nothing changes. You're really stubborn. I call it finally knowing how to keep a boundary." Sarah said nothing more, but before hanging up, she let out one final line, soft as breath, but filled with calculation. "You're going to lose your son. I'm telling you now so you can prepare." I let her words hang in the air. Then I answered with a truth she likely wasn't ready to face. "No. You don't understand Lucas the way I do. It's because I stepped back for too long that you began to think you could decide what's right for him in my place." Sarah hung up. The house returned to silence. I stood up and poured more water into the teapot. My hands trembled slightly, but not out of fear. It was because I had just closed the last door of an illusion, the illusion that silence would somehow make things return to how they once were. In the afternoon, Lucas called again. He sounded exhausted, like someone who had just gone through a battle he didn't win. "Dad," he said, without the usual circling around. "Sarah and we argued. She told me I had to choose. I can't choose." I leaned against the wall, eyes closed. "Lucas, you don't have to choose." "No," he said, voice tight. "I do. And I choose my own little family. I choose my wife." "But—" He paused, breathing heavily. "I don't choose the way she treated you." I opened my eyes. For the first time in years, I heard a more grown version of my son. "Dad," he continued, I understand why you did what you did, and I'll figure out the loan myself. I'll talk to the bank again. I'll also talk to Sarah directly. But I need you to know, I don't want to cut ties. A soft exhaustion spread across me, the exhaustion of someone who had just reached the end of the hardest part of the path. I know, I said, and I don't want that either. Lucas was silent for a moment, then asked in a smaller voice, "Are you angry with me?" That question made me hesitate. Was I angry? Yes. Angry for a long time. Angry enough to relive that moment, the door closing in front of me, as a kind of humiliation wrapped in polite pretense. But beneath the anger there was something else, something only a parent my age would understand how to name. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm disappointed, but I also know you're trying to make things right." Lucas seemed to exhale in relief. "Dad, when are you free? I want to bring the baby over." An invitation I had stopped hoping to hear. "Tomorrow evening," I said. "I'll cook something." The call ended, leaving behind another silence, this time gentler, warmer, no longer stinging like 2 days before. The next evening, when Lucas walked into the house carrying the child, I looked at the scene longer than necessary. The baby looked up at me wide-eyed, unaware of the quiet battles the adults had just fought. Lucas set the child down and said, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him and saw a man trying to stand on his own legs. Then I placed my hand on his shoulder. This time I said, "I'm letting you walk on your own, and I'm still here, as a father, not as a shadow. Life is strange. To keep something, sometimes you have to let go first." And that night in the old kitchen, I realized I had regained something I thought I had lost long ago. Not power, not respect, but the place of a true father. Thank you for listening to my story until the very end. If you want to continue following me through these real rough-edge stories and honest lessons, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the next ones.